Happy birthday, President George Washington, the first president of these United States. Welcome, one and all, to another presidential birthday toast series. Today, we raise our glass in toast to the first president of these United States, George Washington. And I've got a lot of different libations out here, and I had to dispute and debate in my mind, what should we use? Should we use unaged corn whiskey because that was close to what he would produce? Should we use rye whiskey because that was closest to the mash bill? Champagne, as he was known to enjoy at dinner. I looked through, and with all the research that I could do, he also was a huge fan of porter beer that was sweetened with molasses, which we will get into that later. But I figured the most apropos would be Madeira, a favorite of George Washington, and as we'll get into later on in the series, one of the drinks that kicked off the American Revolution. So, General George Washington, the highest ranked military official to ever hold office, because we've had Dwight Eisenhower, I believe, was the second highest. He was General of the Army. George Washington was General of the Armies and of the Continental Army. He was General of all branches of the military and Commander-in-Chief. So he is considered the highest ranking military official to ever hold office in the United States. So there's a lot we could get into with General President. The man wore a lot of hats. George Washington. I figured a good place to start was Washington. Oh, and by the way, necessary source material, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt. Cannot recommend this book enough. Fascinating read, fun read. You find out things you wouldn't have ever thought about U.S. presidents. And what I like about this book is it humanizes people that we tend to put on very high pedestals. So, Washington, like other generals, had to draw a hard line on soldiers and officers who drank themselves into states of inebriation. But he was also eager to dispense a moderate rum ration, as was standard practice of the day, when his men needed it or when their efforts deemed them worthy of an extra shot. And yes, the daily rum ration was a very normal aspect of military life. Most sailors were given a daily rum ration, and most soldiers. And in those days, even military letters would talk about how it was the men's one respite in all of their life and all of their day. Now, when the words Washington and whiskey appear next to each other, typically that talks about the Whiskey Rebellion, which Alexander Hamilton, oh boy, always looking for a new source of income, a new source of conflict, decided to tax whiskey. And so that led about the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, interestingly enough, 3 years later, Washington actually opened up a distillery at his own Mount Vernon. Some folks wonder if he got inspiration from some stills he saw up at the Whiskey Rebellion. It's really hard to say what inspired the idea, but the idea that didn't at least spark the idea, who's to say? What I found very interesting was somebody that was working for him on his farm, a man by the name of Mr. Anderson. James Anderson, a Scottish-born farm manager, got Washington into the idea. In June of 1797, Washington wrote to a friend, "Mr. Anderson has engaged me in a distillery on a small scale and is very desirous of increasing it, assuring me from his own experience in his country and in Europe that I shall find my account in it." Account was another way of saying you'll make money, so not a bad idea. In fact, this was kind of a known commodity in his area, so it actually became currency. And in one instance, one of his neighbors paid in crops of corn and rye in exchange for 30 plus gallons of whiskey and some flour ground at Washington's mill. I found that just fascinating that even General Washington engaged in using whiskey as a currency. And then the formula for his whiskey seemed to be about 60% rye, 35% corn, and a very meager amount of malted barley. And that's really necessary for especially distillation in this time. There was nowhere to get enzymes, so you had to get those enzymes naturally through at least 5% malted barley. So fascinating that even back then, that same practice was well known. And yes, you can to this day, if you want, you can get a fairly authentic replica, if you will, of Mount Vernon's rye whiskey. It's still for sale and it's actually unaged. I'll see if I can ever get my hands on that. But now, folks, we move on to the crossing of the Delaware. Turns out we've all heard the tale that Washington crossed over quietly and the Hessian soldiers were ambushed because they were drunk. Turns out, and again, from this marvelous book, there's no historical evidence that the Hessians were handicapped by drink, just utterly ambushed by a large force of Americans during a snow and sleet storm. They still had a rather large supply of rum on hands. So it just turns out that they just had superior forces, superior tactics, and caught them off guard. So, really can't hold that against any particular troop in that day. But it's so strange that to this day, the rumor of drunkenness amongst the Hessians still persists, even though there might not be a lot of truth to it. And yes, he was a huge fan of a dark porter by a Mr. Robert Hare. And this is actually a letter he sent. I beg that you send me a gross of Mr. Hare's best bottled porter if the price is not enhanced by the copious draughts you took it in the late procession. So he was really wanting to get his hands on this marvelous dark porter. He also had a family recipe for small beer. And also, just one last little aside from this book before I close it and get into Washington. He had several names for his favorite foxhounds, which were Drunkard, Tippler, and Tipsy. So he named his 3 foxhounds after drinking terms, which I found very fascinating. But regardless, nonetheless, George Washington, an accomplished general on the battlefield, the first president of these United States, and the man that set the precedent of 2 terms, and then he went home to his farm. So because of all of this, we raise our glass to George Washington, the first president of these United States. Happy birthday, Mr. President. So, folks, whatever libation you might have, whether any kind of wine, whether it be sparkling, red, fortified, any kind of whiskey, rye, corn, whatever you may have, raise that libation one more time, folks, in honor of the first president of these United States, George Washington. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Thank you for joining me here for this birthday celebration toast of George Washington. I'll see you around, folks.